Hi everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be focusing on our special topic for this module, ageism and ableism. So today we're going to be looking at aging and disability and how we can be more inclusive. So here's the overview of what we'll be doing in today's e-class. We'll start with the learning objectives. Then we're going to briefly discuss the isms. Again, we'll be going over this in more detail in future sessions, but I just want to give you an understanding of what the isms are in order to help frame our discussion of ageism and ableism. So the objectives for this class session are fairly straightforward. I'd like you to learn a bit about ageism and how it impacts older adults, learn about ableism and how it impacts people with disabilities, and think through and identify some ways that you could address and reduce ageism and ableism in your day-to-day life. So to help guide our work in this e-class as well as throughout the semester, let's talk a little bit about what the isms are. Now these definitions come from the handout, The Isms and Other Social Justice Terminology, that's also included in your additional resources in this module. So the isms are prejudicial attitudes directed against groups that society identifies as lesser. So individuals and groups that are seen as less capable, less productive, and less normal. Isms create social structures in which fewer opportunities and resources are made available to those who are identified as being part of this group, as of being of lower status. And the isms are really pervasive throughout our society. Um, they're pervasive in a social context in terms of microaggressions and macroaggressions, which we're going to talk about more detail. So this is really in terms of the language and ways that we interact with individuals from different groups. And they're also systemic in our society, in our policies, and in our programs. And so a big focus of social work is on trying to eradicate these isms, both at the social and at the policy level. So we're going to start with one that you're likely all familiar with. And this is ageism. So ageism is prejudiced thoughts and discriminatory actions that are directed at someone based on their age. Now, traditionally, we think of ageism as being directed at older adults. And these are assumptions that older adults aren't capable of contributing to society anymore, that they're not capable of living active or engaged lives. You may have seen various memes on, how the baby boomers destroyed our economy, things like that. These are all ageist depictions of older adults. And you think about it in terms of makeup and things like that. The idea is that getting older or having signs of aging are bad. These are all ageist attitudes. And these ageist attitudes have negative effects on health and self-esteem, both for the person who the ageist attitude is directed towards. So for the older adult who experiences ageism and is not able to work or to engage in their communities in the way they want to. But it's also negative for individuals who act out that ageism. Because if we're lucky enough, we're all going to get older. And if we continue to hold these negative views towards aging, it actually is detrimental to our personal health and our personal self-esteem. And so again, ageism keeps older adults from working, accessing services, receiving proper treatment. Often ageist assumptions inform healthcare practices, and older adults may not get all the services that they should get because of beliefs and myths about aging. Now, I know what you're wondering. Well, sure, older adults may experience ageism, but I get called a millennial all the time. And when I'm called a millennial, it's never in a good way. And this is true. Ageism can also be directed at younger populations, right? So ageism, again, is that idea of discrimination based on age, not anything else about the individual, not about their strengths or abilities or anything like that. It's assumptions that are made about a person simply because of their age. So the idea that millennials don't want to work, all of these negative depictions of millennials that we have in society that are really toxic, those are also examples of ageist attitudes. And they're things that as social workers, we really need to try to get A, out of our vocabulary, and B, help others get out of their vocabulary because they don't benefit anyone. They're very harmful to the individuals they're directed at as well as ourselves. And so while we may experience ageist attitudes throughout the life course, I think it's particularly important to think about ageism in terms of older adults. And this isn't just because I study older adults as a researcher, but it's also because there are millions of older adults in the US right now. There are going to be billions around the world. And if we continue to hold on to these ageist attitudes, these ideas that older adults can't do things, that they shouldn't be able to work, that they're not capable, then we're really going to hurt the health and well-being of millions of individuals. And that's going to have ramifications for our society as well. So in the US, in 2015, there were 47.8 million older adults. So 65 is kind of the traditional age of retirement. So that's often what we researchers use as kind of the benchmark of older age. And so by 2050, it's estimated that there will be as many as 89 million people who are over the age of 65. There are two main reasons for this population aging. So baby boomers, that cohort is incredibly sizable, and with their high life expectancy, they're going to continue to progress through old age in numbers that we've never seen before. And so again, what we do to engage these baby boomers in their later years has important implications for their health and well-being, for our communities, and for really our society overall. Now, as we finish up our section on ageism, I want you to take a few minutes and really think about these questions. So what are some times in your life when you've experienced ageism? When are some times that you've held ageist attitudes, whether subconsciously or consciously? What are some questions you have about ageism? And what are some things that you could do to help reduce ageism in your community? Think about these, write them down in your journals. I'd really like to hear your ideas on how you're seeing ageism play out in your communities and what you think would be some steps or some approaches to really helping to reduce ageism and giving everyone an opportunity, whether it be younger individuals or older individuals, to be fully engaged in their communities. Next, we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about ableism. Now, ableism is the prejudiced thoughts and discriminatory actions based on differences in physical, mental, and/or emotional ability. And this is usually done on the part of able-bodied or able-minded persons against people with illnesses, disabilities, or less developed skills or talents. Ableism can occur in terms of words and actions, so derogatory terms, derogatory slurs, things like that. But they can also occur in terms of the design of services, programs, and infrastructure. Often, much of our buildings, our programs, and things like that have been developed by people who are able-bodied. And so often we don't give enough consideration to how accessible and usable our environments, our programs are. And this, again, this is unintentional. It's really that we haven't thought about it, but it's still a form of ableism because it discriminates against individuals who have disabilities. So like ageism, ableism is something that we're likely all to experience at some point in our lives. Now, you may currently know someone who has a disability. You yourself may have experienced having a disability. For example, you may have broken your leg at some point and used a wheelchair. And it's estimated that over 1 billion people around the world and as many as 37 million people in the US are currently living with a disability. And just as we talked about seeing increases in the number of older adults, we're also likely to see the rates of disability increase in the US and around the world because of population aging. The risk of disability increases as we age. Now, we're also going to see increased numbers because the life expectancy of people with disabilities has increased dramatically in the last few years. So advances in medicine and technology means that individuals who experience car accidents, trauma and war, were born premature with low birth rate, are now surviving, whereas they haven't in previous decades. And it's important for us to really consider ableism and what it means for these individuals and for our society. The research suggests that having a disability means that you have less access to healthcare services, and you're more likely to experience unmet healthcare needs than someone without a disability. And people with disabilities also experience barriers to employment, social, and community participation. And these barriers are largely created by our ableist attitudes, both in terms of our kind of social discussions with people, how a doctor interacts with an individual with a disability, as well as structural factors, whether or not a building's accessible. For example, one of my friends who has spina bifida and uses a wheelchair has a lot of difficulty accessing medical services because often the exam tables don't lower enough to a level where she can transfer easily out of her wheelchair and onto the bed. And so these basic things that we take for granted as people who are able-bodied, so such as being able to go to the doctor and be checked out with no fuss or anything like that, are not always the case for people with disabilities. So the example of my friend who uses a wheelchair kind of provides a good example of structural ableism, or how our environments often take disability for granted. But ableism is also ingrained into our language. For example, you may have noticed that in the book, they refer to people with disabilities as being handicapped. Well, our language has evolved, and as the disability rights movement has progressed, we've really changed the way that we talk about disability and people with disability. So the term handicapped is not really used or accepted anymore in the disability community. Instead, if you're working with a person with a disability, you want to use that person first language. Similarly, if you want to say somebody is a person without a disability or that they're able-bodied versus being a normal person or a healthy person, because that implies judgment. And so, people with disabilities can be just as healthy as people without disabilities. But saying a healthy person implies that a person with a disability can't be healthy. Now, might also want to use the term person who uses a wheelchair instead of someone who's confined or restricted to a wheelchair. Many people who use wheelchairs don't see themselves as restricted or confined. They actually view their wheelchair as a tool that allows them to live the lives that they want to live and see it as a positive in their life. And so using that confined or restricted language is really disempowering. Instead, you want to really focus on the empowerment side. So they are using a wheelchair. As well as when you discuss a person with a physical disability, you want to use that terminology versus the outmoded or outdated terms such as crippled, lame, deformed, invalid, or spastic. Those are terms that really aren't accepted anymore. And especially if you're working with someone with a disability, those are really harmful and derogatory terms to use. And again, just as I said before with using the term handicap parking or handicap bathroom, again, that's an outdated term. Nowadays, people in the disability community really seem to prefer the term accessible parking or bathrooms. Again, it's that more positive side of things, that these spaces and these bathrooms are designed to allow them to live the lives that they want to live. People with disabilities often experience ableism, barriers, and discrimination in their everyday lives. For example, again, my friend who uses a wheelchair and had difficulty accessing appropriate medical services. So now to explore ableism in further detail, we're going to do a two-part activity. For the first part, I want you to think about your home, work, or school environments and ask yourself whether or not someone with a disability would be able to easily access and use these places. And you can choose someone with any kind of disability. So they could have a physical disability and use a wheelchair, a walker, cane, or crutches, or they could be an individual who has a vision or hearing impairment. So you're going to pause the video and write these ideas down. Then, next, you're going to move on and watch a video. And while you're watching the video, I want you to again think about the accessibility of your environment. And you're going to answer the following questions. What things in your environment that you looked at before, your home, work, or school environments, did you not identify that you now think could pose a barrier to a person with a disability? What kinds of things do you think able-bodied individuals take for granted? And how could you work to help reduce ableism in your community? That wraps up our special e-class on ageism and ableism. Up next, if you haven't already, make sure you complete the self-assessments. You're also going to want to start working on e-class 2 in this module, Module 2, and complete the Choose Your Own Adventure activity. Again, to stay on track and help you progress through this course, make sure you're doing these activities once a week. So one e-class activity and one other activity each week. So next week, you should be doing e-class 2 and complete the Choose Your Own Adventure activity. The week after that, you're going to want to be doing e-class 3 and social work stance. All right, if you have any questions, don't forget to email me.